Welcome to a special mailbag episode of the It's a Mimic podcast, where I, Adam, am sitting down with one of our Patreon subscribers, Gerald, who has generously become one of our patrons of Platinum Great Worm tier. That means that he's able to sit down and record an episode with us, and he decided that today we're going to be discussing mass combat and his homebrew rules for it. So, first of all, hi, Gerald. How you doing?
Not too bad. Getting back into things.
Did you take a break off of D&D over the holidays?
Yeah, like 3 weeks, I think. We took off. So we just had our first session back this Friday, actually.
Wow. And are you using these mass combat rules that you've homebrewed yet, or are you gearing up to use them?
So every time that I introduce something that's not in the source materials, I have a tendency to kind of trickle it in a little bit and kind of tease it into the game to make sure that, it's working reasonably well, outside of little tweaks or adjustments to make it a little bit more smooth or easy to navigate, and B, that the people who are playing the game don't hate it, right?
Yeah.
So for this one, we've done two big moments where these came into play. The first was kind of really the small introduction, saying, hey, this is kind of how we think it's going to work. This is essentially the play test. Here's your group. There's the enemy group. Let's play through it and see what you guys think. And then the next time we did it, we went out a little bit more to say, okay, now you have this group of soldiers, you can build your armies, put your command in place, and you can kind of run through it and get a feel for how it works, soup to nuts, and if we want to keep kind of iterating and really massage this into the game. They just hit the tier of their level and their kind of place in the world, where they can throw their weight around a little bit. So this is when I expect that we'll start to see more and more of the opportunities arise for us to kind of play with these rules.
Mm-hmm. So you're planning on, is the campaign going to go to level 20?
Yeah.
So you're going to be running into this quite a few more times then, right?
Yeah, I would. Yeah. I hope so, given the amount of energy I've dumped into it at this point.
All right, well, first off, before we get into it, let me talk for a second about mass combat. And I only have a couple of things to say, which I'm sure shocking everybody. But I would like to spend the majority of this time looking at what you've already built and then kind of massaging it to make sure you're getting the best bang for your buck. So the very first thing that I want to point out, though, is that there are 3 different ways of attacking mass combat in Dungeons & Dragons specifically. The first one is to just play D&D and have it be the background. Now, on the Campaign Builder series on the Patreon, Tyler and I talked about this at length for a couple episodes. Was it Tyler and I or Kyle? I forget who it was, but we addressed this for a while, and we've talked about it a couple of times. The idea that we're zooming in and the players still have the basic action economy, we're still in initiative, but the setting is the center of a battlefield. And how we would use initiative to narrate things, how we would inject chaos into it, and how we would include skill challenges to get across a battlefield. And if you fail enough, you've got to zoom in on a combat, and then you zoom out for more skill challenge. And there's a lot of just using the regular D&D mechanics, but it's chaotic. It's difficult to manage resources that way because you're not getting short rests or long rests in, and you need to use some of your big spells. And it puts you right in the center of absolute mayhem without necessarily feeling any forward momentum or seeing the overarching way that the combat itself, the war, is going, right? So it's probably, in my opinion, the best way of managing it from a Dungeons and Dragons perspective, but it's not going to necessarily give you the feel that I think most of us want of playing with these big armies, right? So we're zoomed in on a handful of soldiers, which are our characters. The next way, the second way of doing it, is to just replace the combat with a metaphor. I've seen this done with chess games. Risk. We did it with an escape room one time where we said, hey, instead of a skill challenge, we're going to do an escape room, and depending on how long it takes us to get through it, that'll determine how many of the NPCs in here will survive this elaborate trap that you're in. Instead of us kind of getting bogged down in an entire 5-hour session of one trap, which is the problem with mass combat as well, is you can sit in it for hours and hours if you're not careful, right? So that's my second one. It's just straight up replacement and metaphor, and then narrating afterwards what happened, right, based on the outcome of whatever you have used as an analogy. And then the last one, and the one that you've gone with, is a blending of the two, where what you're doing is, in my head, I call it the mini game. It's still Dungeons and Dragons because some of our stats and some of our abilities still matter, but it's largely a brand new mechanic that no one has seen before and we don't interact with on a weekly basis. Like the chase mechanics in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, or Bastions now in the 2024 DMG. These are really cool mechanics, like the crafting rules, really neat, but these are a mini game. Like it's not D&D. We're not using most of our skills or our abilities. We're using one or two and just kind of throwing everything else out the window, right? So for example, the system that you've come up with, I've skimmed over it and we're going to get through it in a minute, but you're not taking into consideration things like hit dice or gear or spell slots. That's not the point of what you're doing. It's a new system that we're injecting into our D&D narrative. And I find that most mass combat works this way, right? That's the Warriors of Krynn for Dragonlance works that way. Matt Colville's Warfare from his independent books that are supposed to sync up with 5th edition, they work that way. They were like card based as well. So those are my two favorite, I think. But anytime that I see mass combat, and I've tried to design it myself a number of times, I'm never happy with it because it never feels D&D enough. But if you go too far into D&D, then it doesn't feel mass combat enough, right? So that's the gripe most people have. So my first question for you is, how important is it for you to keep the flavor and the mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons in your mass combat system? Or are you willing to just set it all aside to do this other really cool mini game that, picks little bits and pieces out as needed?
For this specific game, right?
Yeah.
Because it's based on, kind of source material that is an homage towards. There's a bit of extra massaging that's going on in the background for that, right? So, some of the flavor of the game is kind of borrowed both in a narrative and a mechanical sense, kind of from games of our childhood, right? So that's part of the impetus for this particular design. In this case, I would say, 60-40. 40% is I want to hem to, relatively closely. Definitely Dungeons and Dragons should matter as an element of this game, right? Like I don't want to pull everybody out of it and say this is a whole new thing that we're doing, right? I don't want to go all the way to Warriors of Krynn, right? Where it's you set up a whole new universe. I want to be able to relatively seamlessly kind of shift from one side to the other without having to blow up an entire session and go, all right, now it's going to take me 2 hours to set this game up for us to play. Right?
Yeah. That's actually a good question. So is how long should a combat take when you're looking at a gigantic battle? How many sessions or parts of sessions? Like, what are you expecting? And I mean, it's going to vary depending on the sizes, but let's say an average battle. How long do you expect that to take in hours?
So I want this to run and a similar scale to a regular fight, right? So when I match up kind of what the armies are going to look like versus or the enemy versus the player characters and armies, I want those kind of scales to be similar to what I would do from a CR and character perspective, right? So, winnable but hard, I expect it to take about a 2-hour block, between the strategizing in the beginning, which just like with before battle kicks off, sometimes can go a little bit wild, right? But this particular mechanism gives some of those players who really like to dig in and strategize and think about like what the battle is going to look like and how it's going to unfold, kind of that level of engagement and interaction. where they can really play that game. They can wink towards wargaming a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But hopefully without us doing it for a month.
So you've got a couple of different kinds of wars going on here. The first is two armies meeting on a battlefield, and the second one is a siege.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the two armies on the battlefield first, and getting into that before we add the siege aspect on, because you've got pages worth of notes about how different cities and fortresses and palaces and whatnot are going to not palaces, capitals rather, are going to stack up against an invading army. So walk me through, what are the basic building blocks that we're dealing with here, and help me understand as a player what I'm going to need to keep an eye on in order to participate in this mass combat.
Okay, so the basic breakdown of an army itself, right, is whatever the base unit is. So you've got your infantry, your cavalry, your archery units. They're going to be headed by a commander, and they're going to have a lieutenant and a tactician. Those are the three roles that a player character or NPC can run, right? So they're going to make the decisions for the army, moving it, making the attack rolls, setting and evading traps or maneuvers. Those are going to be the three characters within each of those units to do that. Each of the units themselves is broken down into like different groups. You can have anything from a conscript to an elite unit, right? Those units are going to determine, what their starting morale is, how effective they are in combat, how much damage they ultimately do. The more elite your units are, the more effective your army is going to be, right? With the basic unit types, you're going to have different speeds, different abilities to kind of maneuver, or different ranges with which the armies can attack. So, an archer is going to be able to attack from a couple spaces away, but if you get your infantry unit right in their face, you're probably going to be able to rip them apart, right?
Okay, so hold on really quickly. When we look at the battle map, we're zooming out, right? So that we've got like a bird's eye view of a whole battlefield. And so when we're dealing with squares, it's not like a 5-foot square. It is just a representation of this battlefield has been broken into this grid, essentially. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, we're not dealing with particular feet or meters squared, right? It's just squares. We're just dealing with squares because every battlefield is different.
Right. We hand wave the distance on that a little bit, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So everything is managed through the squares or the hexes that you're running through, rather than trying to hem too closely to.
And each type of troop takes up one square?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that goes, we use size modifiers so that we can, are we playing a small combat, or are we playing a large combat? That gets back to, wanting to keep the speed of things going relatively well, right? Yeah. So if we've got a really big army in there, we want to be able to make sure that the damage it's receiving is enough that you're going to be able to eat through it fast enough. But if you have a small army, we want to make sure that the damage you're doing to it isn't going to just eradicate it. So we broke it down into two tiers, the small tier combat and the large tier combat, based on the size of the armies that we're playing with.
Okay. So that brings me to my next question. So we've dealt with size. We've dealt with, you said that there are three kinds of commanders, right?
Yeah.
There's the commander, the lieutenant, and the tactician. What's the difference between them? How do they operate separately from each other?
So they're all going to have different roles on the battlefield. The commander is going to be a wisdom-based role. They're going to move the army, and they're going to kind of command the overall, kind of structure of the thing. They'll contribute to some of the defenses. When we make attacks, there will be things that go against the commander's leadership stat. So I guess we can talk about that a little bit. Let's jump into, when we talk about each of those roles, they're going to contribute a stat to the army, right? And the army is broken down, or the stat lines are broken down into three: leadership, war, and tactics, right? Leadership they get from the commander, from the leader. That's wisdom based. War is going to come from the lieutenant, your frontline commander. That's going to be either strength or dexterity. And then tactics is going to come from your tactician, and that's going to be an intelligence base. All of those are modified by charisma in order to give you what that score is and what your army has. And then based on the action that you're going to take in the battle, whether that's moving, defense, attack, anything that you encounter that you need to make a roll against one of those things, whichever position holds that stat line is going to be the one that's going to make that roll, right? So your commander is going to make the leadership rolls, your frontline commander will make the war rolls. They're going to coordinate to steer the army.
So okay, I'm bouncing around in your notes a bunch here because it's 9 pages and then like 4 pages of PDFs, right? So like there's a lot here. So I'm bouncing around a little bit. For leadership, clearly you're looking at wisdom and charisma, right? These are the two for the commander, right? And you actually have, well, we'll talk about it later, different feats for them, right? And you have a wisdom or charisma of 13 or higher as a prerequisite, right?
Yes.
Now,
for the feats.
Yes, for the feats. I think that it is. I know that anyone can step up to be any of these, but I feel like there needs to be a check, a roll, something so that they earn this position instead of just like how do we know who the tactician is? Is it just decided among the players? Do you as a DM have an NPC appoint them, or do they have to make a roll to convince a group of people? Like what's the inciting incident that lets them step into this role?
The way that I did it was kind of hand the players what the options were, right? And say which of these tracks is more appealing to you or your character, right? I would say I was surprised by precisely none of the choices that were made.
Yeah.
Because they're really set up in a way that unless somebody is going against type, there's going to be a clear option for basically any class, right? Just based on whatever your primary stat is. If characters run contrary or are playing with that stereotype stuff a little bit, you can see some change. But I don't have a ton of that at my current table, so I let them kind of run with that a little bit, especially because it's new, and especially because I made it. I don't want to force feed anybody anything, right? I want to make sure that they've got as much kind of agency to play around in it as we can, especially while we kind of play test through it.
So one of the things that I'm looking at here, and the first pain point that I would identify is I'm trying to think of all of the different kinds of player characters that are available. And you've got commander who relies on wisdom, lieutenant who relies on strength and dex, and the tactician who relies on intelligence. A sorcerer has constitution and charisma naturally as their bonuses, and there's nothing there for that kind of build. Now you do have listed a little bit further down, there's leadership, war, and tactics that they can do, includes charisma, but I would have it be something along the lines of the commander should have, and follow me on this, you've broken down the commander contributes overall leadership, deciding where the army moves and helping it to evade enemy attacks. This to me says this is someone who has seen war before and has survived and has worked their way up the rank. And I would have wisdom and constitution be the two things that they should be focused on. If you've got a high con score, that means that you've survived a number of battles and people look at you as a large physical specimen, that general that's just like nothing but shoulders and muscle walking among the troops, inspiring them, right? The lieutenant is strength and dex, and I have no problem with that. The tactician manipulates the battlefield, attempting to disorient, disrupt, or damage enemy forces with tricks and schemes to give your army the upper hand. That's not just intelligence, that's also charisma, because it's insight, is traditionally wisdom, but it's your persuasion, it is your deception, it is understanding how people work. Right. And with that in mind, I would have there be, when you come to your feats or your different stats, leadership, war, and tactics, you could be combining a couple of roles that doesn't rely on charisma, because there are going to be entire builds, a rogue, for example, or a cleric or a barbarian that are going to tank charisma. So even if they're a frontline commander, even if they are a lieutenant and they've got high strength and dex, when it comes time for them to use the war ability, they're relying on a stat they don't have, right? They need that charisma to do it. And while charisma makes a whole lot of sense because you need to be charismatic to lead people into battle, you can inspire people with, feats of strength or with reputation or by being particularly wise or being that gigantic, and we see this in some of the playable species like orcs and whatnot, might makes right. The biggest guy there will have people following, right? So constitution makes sense for that in some ways. So I would say instead of it being charisma and wisdom for leadership, charisma and strength for war, charisma and intelligence for tactics, I would just have it be 2, 2, and 2, because someone will always have something to be able to rely on, no matter what the character build is. Does that make sense?
No, it makes complete sense. And the archetype that you described, the guy who's all soldier or all shoulders rather, and has has been through all of this before. I think that kind of lays out your frontline commander more than anybody else there, right? They're the ones that are in the thick of it.
Then perhaps Dex would be someone with the commander who is going to be in like the back line, right, where the ranged characters usually sit, right? This is going to be someone who's going to be able to avoid incoming bombardments from ranged soldiers and making dexterity saves, as opposed to someone who's strength and con in the front, right?
Yeah, I like that shakeup.
So there's different ways to massage this, but do you understand my mentality on it? We have 6 stats and you've got 3 different command types. So we should put 2 different stats on each one of them.
Yeah, I like that.
My next question is, you've got troop training. You've got 4 levels, conscript, soldier, veteran, and elite. And each one gets a different damage die, D6, D8, D10, and 2d6. First of all, 2d6 is a huge leap from d10. It's a much better option than 1d12 because it's the only option you have where they cannot roll a 1. And
it is, but it also, you're much less likely to get a 12 on it. It hovers its way in the middle. I went back and forth a lot on that one if I wanted, because if I jumped it up to a D12, it's you've got a better chance of getting the higher numbers, whereas with 2d6 you're more likely to stay around the center. So it's playing between consistency or the heavy hand of chance.
The way that I would fix that is by making them all D6s with a modifier. So the conscript is a +1, so it's a D6 +1, soldier's D6 +3, veteran's D6 +5, or whatever your jumps are, right?
Ooh, that's an interesting idea.
Because that's going to flatten the math and make it feel like these different levels aren't nearly as swingy, because even your veteran can roll a 1 against conscript, which can roll a 6, right? But if you've got these modifiers, then conscripts D6 +1 versus elite D6 plus 1, 3, 5, 7. That means that the elite will never lose to a conscript. The minimum they can get is an 8, and the maximum a conscript can get is a 7, right?
Yeah,
that makes sense.
I like that way better. Yeah.
But my next question is, damage dice are all well and good. How many hit points are we talking about for each one of these things?
So the health that we look at is based on the number of soldiers. So basically, every soldier is a hit point when we're rolling damage. So how many soldiers is your army capable of taking down? It's going to be modified by your troop training, right? The effectiveness of their actual attacks is going to be led by your lieutenant who's making the attack rolls. They're running the war stat, right? So when we roll 2 hit an army, if you hit, you're doing damage. Your damage is determined by the training of your troops.
So if we've got something like an army with 10,000 troops, every round we're going to be doing a D10 here, a D8 there, 2D6 here, right? That's a long fucking battle.
Yeah, that's why we modify it for how much damage it's doing, right? So in a small scale battle, the damage that you're doing is your roll times 10. When you're in a large scale battle, you're talking about having those bigger troops, those bigger troop totals,
Gotcha.
that's when you're looking at your die type plus your size modifier plus half your war score. That's times 100. So you're losing hundreds of troops at a time every time there's an attack, because there are so many more soldiers on the field, right? So anytime that you have an army that's bigger than 2,500 people, you're knocking scores of people down every time you run an attack.
Gotcha. Okay, so for example, in your original model, the conscript is a D6. Let's say that they've got 2,000 people in the army, right? 2,000 conscripts. So that is +1 for every 500 units is what you got here. So D6 +4 plus half of the war score, and war equals, we're going to call it strength plus con, I guess, and that's modifiers, right? Not stats. So we can say comfortably an 8, right? Like, or a 7 maybe, a +3 and a +4 modifiers for strength and con for a barbarian, for example. That makes sense to me. So 7 + 4 is 11. So D6 + 11. And if we take the average, that'll be 3 or 4. So we'll call it 4. So 4 + 11 is 15 times 10. So that's 150. 150 troops would die. If I roll a 6, that would be 15. No, sorry. 11 + 6 is 17. So it'd be 170 troops that die. That's the math that we're working on here. So we're going to watch these troops whittle away. But my question for you is, are you readjusting the math for how many troops are left every round for every single one of these?
Only for the size modifier.
Yes. Yeah. But you're keeping track of all of that?
Yeah.
Do you have multiple troop sets on a battlefield at once?
What do you mean by that? Like multiple battles running concurrently?
Yeah, like we've got the conscripts and then are here, and the soldiers are over here, but they're cavalry, and then the elite are the archers in the back. Like, are you keeping track of all of that, or is it just like this battle is veterans, hard stop?
So I actually have little army cards that we use for each of those. So each of the armies will have, it's got its war number, it's got its the 3 stat lines, it has the size of the troop, how many troops are remaining, the training of the troops, which will have your damage modifier on it. So like all of that's written on there, so I can make adjustments as things go by. So my players can make adjustments as things go by on their armies. For the NPCs, I use a spreadsheet, and I have my laptop open on the side. So when they when they damage an army, I just enter it into the spreadsheet.
Yeah, you'd almost have to do that, right? So you write down the amount of damage, and then you've got an equation that says, okay, there's 230 guys left, right?
Yeah, they have little army cards and that are laminated. They can use dry erase markers on. But for me, because it's me and Brian tracking however many armies are on the field at that point, right?
Yeah, and just to be clear, for anyone that doesn't remember, you co-DM. There are 2 DMs managing this, right?
Right. Yeah. Which is another thing, right? Where if there's any kind of side stuff going on, which we've seen in the past, right? Where we've got, these 4 characters are going to participate in the battle writ large. These 2 are going to circle around behind and try to disrupt the commander's camp, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, well, fine. You guys are stuck with me. We'll track turns and times. You 2 go over with Brian and figure out. And then if your bullshit gets up to some success, Brian and I will sort out what that means for the rest of this battle, which is a nice little piece of flexibility we get to inject here. So
far, I'm liking a lot of this. I do think that changing it to be D6s with modifiers is going to flatten the math. The other thing that I would like to suggest is adding a level below that, which would be a militia, which is just a straight D6 with nothing, no modifier, or even a D4. It would be the only one that's lesser because they are not trained, right? That way you could have a couple of little battles where you've rallied the townsfolk against the invading battalion coming up, right?
Yeah. I'm going to keep conscripts at the bottom because those are like farmers that got pulled off. The militia are people who did it on purpose, right?
Okay, so conscripts. Conscripts.
They'll keep the D6 +1.
They've not been to any training, right?
Right.
Okay. So is there any purpose? I'm looking at this troop size modifier, right?
Mm-hmm.
is there any purpose to splitting a group up? It seems like it's more beneficial to have, or no, I think it would be more beneficial to split them up. Instead of having one army with 2,000, I would rather have two armies with 1,000 apiece, because then I get to add my size modifier, my die type, and my war score to two different rolls. And while the war score, or because of the size modifier, it's -2, but that's better because I'm technically rolling with advantage because I'm rolling twice, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially if you talk about, I mean, I think it's conditional, but it gives you more flexibility. I think ultimately, if one of those armies meets up against one that's significantly larger than it is, right, it's going to get steamrolled. But you know, there are times where that's the tactic, that's the move to make, right? It also gives you additional opportunities to, I mean, from an action economy standpoint, right? It's giving you a better ability to manipulate the battlefield.
Yes.
And I think that's probably true. You just have to weigh the risk and reward when you're making those moves.
So my next thing is, does the army dissipate when it gets down to 0 units, or is there a retreat mechanic?
So they can attempt to retreat as a maneuver, right? So basically anything that you want to do from like a disengage or a manipulate the battlefield in general, right? You're doing that as a part of your maneuvers. There's a list that is not the full set, but any actions that you want to try to take, you're capable of doing. You can force march, so you can like double your speed. You can try to create a distraction or a disruption to prevent the enemy forces from getting a hold of you. If they're shattered in a battle, we zoom in to the characters at that point, because at that point it's all right, you're trying to get away, right? Because your army is dissolved.
Yeah. So these maneuvers, so the tactician, I want to go back. The lieutenant is the one that's in charge of the war rolls, and that's going to apply to the troop sizes. They're out in the army, right? The tactician, where are they? Are they with the army as well? Are they out there on the front line?
They're with the army. Yes.
Okay.
Where within the army is going to depend on kind of the
player's
the
choice.
preference. Yeah. Yeah. Where do you want to sit? From a practical standpoint, I would expect them to largely be with or near the army's commander, because you're going to be giving orders on, you know, placing traps or trying to disseminate kind of, this is what we're going to do in order to make our next, you know, battlefield control action. So being at central command is probably the easiest way to do that.
Yeah.
But again, players are going to be players. So
sure, of course. So traps and maneuvers are the two things that you've got for tacticians to be doing.
Right.
And so you've got, okay, so traps, for example, you have 5 examples here: fire trap, pit trap, falling objects, ambush, and illusory. Each one of these has in brackets you have I, A.
Yeah. So that suggests that it can be used by the infantry or the archery units.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. And I see with maneuvers below you have C for cavalry as well. All right. So for the traps, you have fire trap, pit trap, falling objects, ambush, and illusory. Some of these things I feel like pit traps and ambushes need to be set up ahead of time almost, don't they?
They do. Yeah. So when they know there's going to be a battle in advance, they can go through and take these actions. So, you know, you've got 2 days before the enemy gets here. You're going to organize yourself into your forces, and you're going to start to kind of take these actions. That's where some of this stuff, you're not going to be able to dig a pit trap in the middle of the battle. But
exactly. So there are 2 levels here, right? There's the setup, and then there's also the trigger, right?
Right.
What are the roles for those?
So to successfully, I guess, trick them, what you're doing is you're creating a DC. So the first time that we did this, we rolled the DC. Every other time, or I guess the other time, we just had it. So it's the same DC as like your spell save DC. So it's 8 plus your tactics. And then when they are approaching that trap, when the enemy is approaching the trap, they've got to roll against that set DC.
If you have intelligence plus charisma for the tactics, so that'll be 8 plus, I mean, your average, who's going to have that? Who would have intelligence and charisma? A wizard, I guess.
An enchantment wizard.
Yeah. artificers, right? Like these guys, it makes a lot of sense that these guys be setting traps. Rogues usually have a decent intelligence and a decent charisma, traditionally speaking, in D&D. So like it would make sense. These guys are setting the traps up. The DCs are going to be 8 plus what, 5, 6? So we're talking a DC 13, 14 at mid-range. I mean, it'll get higher than that as the guy's level, but that feels pretty good. Like that's I mean, a 14 is what, a 70% chance to succeed?
Yeah.
So, or sorry, to fool them. Like it's difficult to get past it. So that's like, that feels good. The roll against though, what are they rolling? Are they rolling intelligence or charisma? Like what's the?
They're gonna, so when it's gonna be the same as with the enemies, right? They're rolling their tactics against the tactics
Gotcha.
of, yeah.
Okay,
so whatever that DC was.
Tactics versus tactics. Gotcha.
Yeah.
When it comes to the maneuvers for the tacticians, these ones feel like they're in the moment. These are not set up ahead of time.
Right.
So you have feint, counter, harry, discord, fire arrows, and charge. These are all different maneuvers that can be done. And you got details for each of them too, right? For example, counter imposes disadvantage. And if that attack misses because of disadvantage, then there's an immediate attack as a reaction, right?
Right.
What's another one? Discord, you can drop your enemy's morale by 1. Love that. We'll get into morale in a minute here, but like I love that. That feels really good. Do you only have the 6 options?
No, whatever. So these are only meant as like a spark. So the rule at the table is, what do you want to do? If it fits into one of these things, great. If it doesn't, then tell us and we'll tell you, what you need to do, who should be rolling, and what it's going to do to the other guy.
Yeah, like a false retreat to lure people into a pincher attack or something, right? Like
right.
I get to think of all sorts of things on a battlefield, like to trigger a trap that like I'm thinking falling objects that when you're trying to scale a wall, right? And then like here's my maneuver. I'm gonna dump the oil right onto the enemy, right? So there can be lots of different options. It's cool that it's open-ended. And with the creativity of players and the fact that this is not a 80-page rule book on mass combat, staying flexible is a really good idea.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing is that I don't want to be too prescriptive. I want that creativity because at least half the fun for me as a DM is somebody coming up with something completely insane and me trying to figure out how to make it work.
Right. I want to talk really quickly about the fact that now that I'm looking at some of the maneuvers and some of the tactics, some of the things that are happening in the different troops. So we've got conscripts, soldiers, veterans, and elites, but we also have the 3 different kinds of troops: infantry, cavalry, and archers, right?
Yes.
I want to point out
that's also not full.
That's not full as well?
Right. So, I mean, that's your basic setup. So if you think, if we pull that back even further, it would be what? Frontline, mounted, and ranged.
Yeah.
Right. But if you got enough of them and you wanted to have like a sorcerer corps, right? Well, we'd have to figure out kind of what their attacks look like, but that's what that would look like, right? That's where they would be. So there will be specialty units potentially available in each of those categories, and I guess even maybe more categories if something doesn't fit in the bounds of that.
I would say that there are 4 categories that are missing here that I think that you could play with and have like, here's my standard. Like you have for infantry, broadest flexibility, limited mobility, but reduced terrain effects. Its speed is 2 squares and its range is melee, right?
Right.
Great. You've got that busted out for cavalry as well and for archers, but here are the things that I figure you're missing in a D&D world. One is siege weapons, right?
Yeah.
This is where I'm going to minimize the speed or even say this does not move, right? But its range is this and it does double damage depending on the troop training, something like that, right? I would have huge sized combatants. This is when you have your, and I don't mean like huge, I should say massive combatants maybe. This is when your ogre is wading through troops, right? Or you've got someone has tamed a purple worm for some fucking crazy reason, right? And so this thing is on the battlefield as well, and it's going to tear things up. And these should operate independently of the troop training, right? They should be their own kind of damage type that makes sense. You would almost add beforehand to be like, hey, just so you're aware, your enemy has trolls, which means that they're going to operate as their own single troop as they move through the battlefield, and they're going to have to take this much damage. They're going to do this much damage, but here's kind of what you're looking at ahead of time. So that's your monstrous stuff. Like you said, spell slingers, but I don't know how prolific spellcasters are and magic users are in your world. So having a unit of 500 magicians could actually like wipe an entire continent clean of spellcasters if they all go down, right? Think of the shit that's lost. So I would almost just have them be quote unquote magical archers as far as function goes, right? So that these are mages and apprentices and things using wands. So they would have the ability to do magic missile, or hey, this one does force damage, this one does fire damage, this one does cold damage. It's essentially the same thing as archers, but they do these kinds of damage. It has this kind of effect on the battlefield, but they can only do it 3 times, and then they're infantry because the wands are out. How many wands can you get your hands on, right? Something like that to make them scary early in the battle and not have it be a wizard versus a dragon at the end of the battle. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like that.
And the fourth one that I think that you're missing, and probably the most complicated one, flying units. There's absolutely no reason why they would not be bringing flyers into this, right? And that could just be something as simple as all attacks against them do double damage because they're going to be lightweight, but all of their attacks do double damage as well. And they've got a ridiculous range, or they have a ridiculous speed and the range is melee. You know what I mean? So I'm thinking about dive bombing hippogriffs, right? They're going to fuck up the people on the ground. But if they get hit, they're probably going to be killed, right? They're not going to be that powerful. Same
thing. Fire Emblem of us, it's immune, or it's weak to arrows.
Yeah, shit like that, right? So, and when I was all done and I had it all laid out, I would then come up with a rock, paper, scissors system where every one of them is strong against one thing and weak against another. Because I think that will add a sort of dynamic combat system to how your players are looking at the board going, yeah, man, I've got infantry. I've got three different battalions of infantry, but they're so weak against cavalry, and cavalry are the closest. But I do have these massive creatures, which are really good against cavalry, but they're on the other side of the battlefield. How can I get them over here quickly? That kind of shit, right? These are the ideas that your players could be kind of wrestling with mid-combat.
That is a good call.
So that will probably take a little bit of massaging to see like who's going to be good against what. But because siege weapons are going to be good against cities, right? Clearly, but they're also going to be good against those large creatures. Having 3 arrows go into an ogre is one thing. Having a ballista shoot a fucking tree through it is something else, right? So but if you're shooting a tree through a single dude on a battlefield, that's not really great. So what's your rock, paper, scissors? And so that'd be something that I would play with a bit to add a certain additional level. So if you don't have any other ideas for that, can we talk about your morale system for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely.
So explain it to me first, because I want to make sure that I have this right.
Okay. So for morale, your starting morale is based on the training of the troops, the size of your army, and the leadership of the army. If an army's morale hits 0, it scatters. If an army's morale is significantly higher or lower than the opponent it's facing, it's going to have an effect on that battle, right? So if your morale is twice as high as the morale of your opponent, you get advantage on all your rolls against that army.
Sure.
And the opposite is true, right? If your morale is half that of your opponent, you're at disadvantage for everything. So it's a big swing, or it's a big stick to swing. And there are different kind of modifiers throughout the battle that will either push that up or down. If you receive a critical hit, your morale goes down. If you're outnumbered, your morale goes down. Successfully pulling off a tactic brings it up. If your army defeats another army, your morale increases. And if your lieutenant defeats an enemy in a duel, your morale goes up.
Can I recommend that you get rid of that outnumbered as a negative, because you already have the double mechanic in there, and you will never have two armies, or very rarely have two armies with the exact same number. Someone will always be outnumbered, and so that's just a base state of this math, right? So if you're consistently just giving that -1 to whoever's smaller, I think that you're always going to be dealing with someone at a mild disadvantage. The disadvantage is already replicated by the fact that we're including the size modifier and the damage that's being done. So
That's fair.
so yeah, hitting them with the morale is kind of a double whammy, just because they got hit too hard in the previous round or something. Like, it's not double damage, but suddenly you drop by 120 troops instead of 80, and now suddenly you are doing less damage and your morale drops. That really fucking hurts. So it's going to make your battles far more swingy, and it's going to have a lot of luck. All these rolls are going to be so much more important in the moment, and we're closer at that point to gambling and further from strategizing. So it's not a big deal, but we should keep our eyes out for those things of, like, what are the actual regular scenarios? What is the status quo of every fight? And if you look at the movie Braveheart, the underdogs were almost always outnumbered. They always were outgunned because they didn't have the technology and the armor, right? But their morale was way fucking higher. So even being outnumbered doesn't really affect morale or fierceness when you're dealing with barbarians or centaurs or whatever, right? So
yeah, that's a good call.
So I just want to bust out the math on something. Training level it's training level plus army size modifier plus leadership. And we're calling leadership wisdom plus dex, which I really like, because that means that monks are going to be really suited to be leadership roles, which feels really good. And something like a warlock or a barbarian are not in leadership roles. They've got other things they can be doing on the field, right? So your druids, your rangers, your clerics, your monks, these are your leadership roles, and that feels good. So training level, the only thing that I can find about training is the D6, D8, D10 method, right? So what's that number? Training level is what?
It's basically +1 for every level. So your base is 1, and then every time you go up from the base conscript, you're adding an additional 1 to your.
Okay, so if we've got, let's say, a veteran army of let's say 80,000 troops. That's insane. Let me pull that back a bit. Let's call it 8,000 troops, because that's going to be a little bit easier for us to run the math on. So we're going with a large scale army here, and they're veterans. So that is, veteran is conscript plus soldier, and then veteran. So that's a +3 for the training level, plus the army size at 8,000 is +2, because at this point, when we're large scale, it's +1 for every 5,000 units, right?
Right.
So that's +2, or do we have to crack 10,000 to get that +2?
Yeah, no, it'd be +1 for the first 5,000.
Okay, so +1 for the first 5,000, then so it is +2. So then we've got 3 + 2 is 5, plus our leadership modifier, which is wisdom and dex. So we can comfortably say 7, right? So, and so our morale is looking at 3 + 2 is 5, + 7 is 12. And then critical damage, outnumbered. If we get down to half of what the opponents are, and then it's disadvantage. So there's not a whole lot of retreating that happens in the game, right? Because you've got to take a number of losses. And with the exception of taking critical damage, you don't have any other losses here. You have officer defeated in duel when you are winning, but you should have -2 for having your officer get killed.
Oh, I didn't want to double dip, but it does make sense if they're if they're stone dead, right?
Yeah. So I would be looking at a couple of times where it doesn't work, or where things are hitting them negatively, because morale is an interesting stat to track, because it only ever matters if you run out of it. Even if you have 2 morale, you are still functioning at full strength, right? You're not becoming any lesser. So
no, not until you run into an army with high morale. That's the only other time it's going to matter, because they're going to mess you up.
Are you rolling morale against the other army?
No, but if their morale, if I have a morale of 4 and my opponent has a morale of 2, I'm getting an advantage on my rolls.
Right. When the morale is doubled out of an opponent, all rolls are at disadvantage.
Right.
Gotcha. And then when we lose that morale, so if you and I are rolling morale against each other, we roll 20s and you've got advantage against me and you roll a 17 and I roll a 4, what mechanically changes for me?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
If you and I are playing, we're on opposite sides of the battlefield, you roll up on me and you got a morale with advantage. So you end up rolling a 17. I end up rolling a 4. What mechanically changes for me this round? Does my morale drop, or does this affect modifier for damage that I'm doing?
Modify or morale is only going to modify, so we're not going to roll morale. But if I'm in a position where I have a high morale unit, so my morale is twice what yours is, then when I attack you, my attacks are going to be at advantage. When I try to force your movement on the battlefield through tactics, my tactical actions are going to be at advantage. If you try to lay a trap for me, you're desperate, you're going to be at disadvantage, right? So it's just a matter of kind of boosting. It's an opportunity for, if you've got a really good leader with a well-trained but smaller army, there's a good chance that you're going to be able to do some serious damage up front to a poor leader with a poor trained army, even if it's significantly larger than yours.
So if I lose, if you and I go up against each other, you have higher morale and you get all these bonuses to attack me.
Mm-hmm.
My morale doesn't necessarily drop. I just stay at 4 or whatever, unless you do critical damage to me, you kill my officer or some other thing, and then it starts to drop a little bit, right?
Right.
I would almost have it in there that if the army gets down to, and then just pick a percentage, 10%, 20%, 50% even, it doesn't matter. Just when it drops to a certain number of troops, it will scatter. And then it's no longer considered an army and it's just people running away, right? The morale has failed. There are not enough people to uphold the morale. So if you show up with 500, the moment you drop down to 50, fuck it, I'm out, right? Because I want to preserve them as a storytelling opportunity later in the campaign. The soldiers that lost, that you can come across a group of them in a tavern, or you find a camp of a bunch of deserters, or you come into the city and you find that that there were deserters that are going to be hung in the public, town square or whatnot. Having these troops dissolve could be an interesting factor here. And then, see, that's the other thing too, is if you've got a commander who's using a leadership ability, could absorb a smaller group if it's less than half the size of his current group. You know what I mean? Like, to be able to boost that morale up again. Does all of this make sense?
Yeah.
I'm trying to work out the mechanics for this. I think you need a list of probably 9 or 10 items of things to give pluses and minuses to morale, so that there are a lot of different ways and you can watch it fluctuate throughout the game. And you could have your players see morale as an alternative to combat. As much as the combat's great, if we can break their will, we don't need to do this. We can just...
I already had a player doing that.
That's phenomenal. I would, if the players want to play with that, I would give them more options to play with it. So come up with a list of different things for, and an equal number of positives and negatives. And you said you didn't want to double dip, but I think that having the mirror image, right? My officer defeats yours, I get a +2. Your officer lost, you get a -2. Yeah, man. 4 swing against the troops that we're fighting right now makes a lot of sense. But the moment those troops are defeated and we move on to the next one, I still keep my +2, but the next battalion I run across doesn't have that -2, right? So doesn't...
I like that. If I'm doing that though, I'm going to say that when the army drops below either 10 or 20%, I'm dodging back and forth on it. I'm going to just drop their morale by 5. Because we're not looking at big numbers. 5 is a big number to drop, a 10 or a 12 if you're at the top when that happens.
Yes.
So.
And another thing that I would put in there as well is, if the morale is low enough, then it can be absorbed by another friendly unit with morale or a leadership role or something, right? Depending on who the commander is. If there's a commander in an adjacent unit, they can absorb those troops and re-up their numbers.
I'm gonna make that part of one of the feats.
Yeah, we're going to get into feats here in a second. So is there what are the other mechanics in just the army so far that we're missing?
Let's see. We talked about the troop types.
Oh, one of the
How
things you
to,
have here is after
yeah,
3 hours of, I'm assuming not gameplay, but in world,
yes.
3 hours in combat, everyone loses one morale
Oh yeah,
per
yep.
turn. But you've got rounds are 20 minutes, which means that is after the starting in round 10, we're losing morale once
Hmm.
per turn, right?
Right.
That
That's
means
what I'm saying. We don't want it to go that long.
yes.
Yeah.
I think that if you have, you could still end up with 20 rounds as you're waiting for those really high morale troops to finally like disengage off the battlefield, right? I would just have something, because the way that it works in real life, or the way that it has worked, is combat just fucking ends when the sun goes down and people retreat, right? Like
Yeah.
we will return to the battlefield again tomorrow. So you
Yeah.
can even have a round lasting an hour. After 8 rounds, the battle day is done, both sides withdraw.
Yeah, I had some language in here, but I must have erased it. Must have changed my mind on it. Where I basically highlighted that exact thing.
Just because,
I thought it was too easy.
yeah, just because the 3 hours loses morale once per turn, so every 20 minutes after that means you're doing a lot of unnecessary math for the same basic idea.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right? And I don't think you need to do that. Just have it be like combat lasts 8 to 10 hours depending on the season, right? So 8 in the winter, 10 in the summer, 9 in each of the others. And that's it, right? Like we don't need to go any deeper on that. There will be a withdrawal at that point. And then we'll meet you on the battlefield tomorrow, or they don't show up. They fuck off. You got them, right?
Yeah, did you ever play that janky, what was it? PlayStation 3 game maybe, based on the 100 Years War? I think Koei did it,
No,
where
I don't know what you're talking about.
I think it was called 100 Years War. The screen would just start to go dark, and it would be like, uh-oh, it's dark time, the battle's over.
Well, I mean, that's fair enough, which is not to say that no combats happen at night. And that could be a part of this too, right? Where like if you're fighting drow, that happens at night. But the sun comes up, they're gonna fuck off, right? And this lets you kind of sit down and renegotiate and reconsolidate your forces and say, I only had 600 guys left in this one, and I had 1,300 in that. Bang! Now I've got one with 1,900, and this is going to be the commander for it, right? Like, and you
Right.
can work together like that. Are you able to have two commanders in the same troop unit?
No. I don't have any way to adjudicate if they did.
I don't think it's a big deal if they've got, because the commander gets a leadership role, the lieutenant gets a war role, the tactician gets a tactics role, and they don't double up on anything. I don't see any problem with that at face value, because you're still only getting one role that they use, so that if you have your whole party go with one group, right, or you have 3 members of the party, and this is the group that needs to survive to get all the way through to take out, because we're gunning for the enemy general.
Mm-hmm.
Then yeah, they should have tactics and war and leadership to get them through. The same way that like I'm not sure I would necessarily do that with the enemy unless it's my big bad evil guy, but it does leave the rest of the army vulnerable, because not every troop unit gets a leader, right?
Every unit has those 3 roles.
Okay.
So for each army, essentially, you're breaking it into. We refer to each of those as an army, but they're, whether you want to call it a squad or a platoon or it is a unit on the battlefield. So each of those is going to be controlled independently based on the grand strategy that was decided at the beginning. Hopefully, who knows? I guess after a round, if anybody's following that.
But if they don't have a lieutenant, they're not going to be able to get the bonus to their damage, right?
Right.
They won't have a war score.
If they lose their lieutenant, that's a big problem. You assume somebody steps up in it, but I would just use like base numbers for it.
I would just use base numbers too. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's your soldier stats.
And that way, like, I see no problem with them stacking 3 characters, 3 commanders on a single unit, because that unit's just going to be so much more effective at everything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So if all 3 characters are like, we are running this show, right? And that's actually what we've had so far, right? They have a collection of NPCs. I've got little NPC cards for each of the ones that they have that are kind of war capable.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, these are their commander stats. Go ahead and plug them in, right? If you're going to do that, you're still in charge of moving that thing around. They're your guys, but you can use those NPCs that work for you in their capacity there. So
Okay.
they've got a couple that are viable for each of those positions as well, if they decide that the player's talents are better applied elsewhere.
Okay, let's jump into the commander or the different command feats that we have before we jump into cities, because I feel like we're already talking about the commander. So let's keep going on this. You've got 3 pages here, one for commander, one for lieutenant, and one for tactician. Each one of them has 4 feats. Are these feats that have to be taken instead of other feats, or are you handing these out on top of your regular class progression?
So they've been handed out as part of essentially each time that they've been awarded an advancement in their whenever they're promoted to the next level of officer. They've been handed out one of these feats. So it's an extra for them, because they're broadly applicable to mass combat.
Yeah.
And not much beyond it.
So, and my next question is, do you need one to get to the other? Like, do these go in order? Like,
yes. Yep.
Okay. All right. So the prerequisite for the second one listed is not just whatever the stat prerequisite is, but also that you also have this feat or these feats before it, right?
Right. So we're going to hand you each of these as you move through it.
Gotcha.
The standard bearer to the expediter to nimble command to masterful command.
That's a lot of fun. I do like giving ranking up mechanics to my players. I think that can be a blast. So is there anything on here? I'm not sure we have time to go through all 12 and then all of the city stuff. So is there anything on here that you feel is a pain point or something that you want to look at specifically? Or sorry, hold on. Or would you rather save these and we can do this in a second episode?
We can do this in a second episode. That sounds fun.
Okay, cool. Because some of these are really fun.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we can skip the feats for now. Just know that there's a bundle of them.
Do you still just have 4 for each? Like that's your idea?
Yeah. Essentially one for each tier. Where as they move up the chain, they get to be not just better warriors, but leaders in this is part of that.
The one thing that I want to say to you before we get started is you got this we're going to move on, but you've got this prerequisite for commander feat. It says wisdom or charisma of 13 or higher. We have talked about changing that to wisdom and dex being the important ones and not charisma. What I would do is to have a combined modifier score of wisdom and dexterity equals this, right? Instead of having your wisdom score, having the combined modifiers, which means that when they level, they can sit there and go, oh, hey, you know what? I want to do more damage strength, but I like being a commander. And if I put just one more point into dex, then I can get up to the next level of command, right? And it gives them kind of the ability to play with it a little bit more if you combine and tweak those feats or the prerequisites. But maybe I wouldn't go too high on it, because some people are going to have a really easy way forward as they've got, strength and con. Yeah. Barbarians will just be great lieutenants. But if someone has only put ranks into one of those things, like strength, they're not going to do so well, right? So,
yeah, that was my thought. And that's also why I kept it relatively low.
I would just have it be, and we don't need the prerequisite for any of the other ones because the prerequisites don't go up, right? Numerically, they don't increase. The prerequisite at that point is just you already have a strength of 13 for a fierce charger, which is the first one. So for duelist, like I'm never not going to have a strength of 13.
Yeah, I might as well just rename each of these lists like the commander track and then give the prerequisite at the top, right?
Yeah, something like that. Anyways, let's move on to the cities.
Cities, yep.
All right. Cities are held that are held by a force can and will contribute to the wealth and effectiveness of that force by contributing forces, gold, and defensible positions. So you have siege rules. These look like headers. Siege rules, possible improvements, available soldiers, available funds.
Yeah. So this is light at the moment. Partially because we hadn't quite gotten that far, and partially because I completely teased out exactly where to go and how far to go. So I'm actually in the process now. It's a good time to talk about it, of weaving in some of the new 5/5 bastion rules in with this.
Yeah.
So sometimes kids sitting on your hands for a little while pays off. Because somebody else will do part of your job for you.
that is
so
Not the lesson we should be promoting here, but yes.
That worked out for me this time. So I'm going to lean pretty heavily onto the Bastion rules for most of the like maintenance and management side of their strongholds.
Yeah.
And then as far as when we talk about sieges, from my standpoint and kind of the notes that I've got to date, there are really two ways to think about that, right? That's skirmishes, which are going to fall under the rules that we already have with the army on army stuff, and that's waiting. And for the most part, that's just going to be modifiers to skirmishes, or to the point where like you lose your bastion, right? So your morale sets are going to change based on how long the siege is in place and how long you're without food and supplies. And your once you get to a certain base morale, you lose the location.
So, okay, first of all, let's talk about morale for a second.
Yeah.
First and foremost, a successfully defended siege should you take an increment of time. A week, a day, doesn't matter. You pick your increment, whatever you feel is right for the siege, for your siege rules in general. But whatever that increment of time is, if you succeed, that should add +1 to your morale. Those assholes aren't getting in here. We're just fine for every time increment that goes by. However, and I think that'll be different, right? Because if it's a fort, if it's a small, like walled keep, for example, then that might be in days. They can't get in here. We've defended them for 5 days. What are they going to do? But if it's a capital city, we've defended them for 5 months. What are they going to do, right? Like we have farmlands in here. Come and get us, right? So we've got a fully functioning port and you don't have ships. What are you going to do to us? Our morale just goes up until a maximum of whatever. And if this is where I would start looking at putting maximums on morale, maximums, because you have a minimum. But I would also, specifically for cities, whether it's a keep or a capital, I would have a negative morale as well. So once they've run out of necessary supplies, and you can determine what those supplies are, whether they are soldiers on the wall, people within the walls that have been killed by like siege weapons, food, water, whatever it is, whatever things that they need to continue surviving. Once they've gone below a threshold, they can get negative. And when it gets into negative morale, -1, -2, -3, you should have things like every day the DM rolls percentile dice to see if there's a riot or to see if there is treason, to see if there is, if one of the people secretly attacks within the city, within even like the main chambers. Suddenly the butler, the general, the whatever, attacks the king, right? Enough is enough. We suffered long enough. Here you go. So I would play with negative numbers and thresholds for what happens when a city is under siege, as far as morale goes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I like that. I like the idea of having a little table of consequences for negative or loss of morale within the holding, right? And I think that too is going to be different if we're talking about a city versus a fort.
Yeah.
In a fort, you're more likely to, I think, experience a mutiny than a riot. But
yes, I agree. And I think
there's fun stuff in both directions.
Yes. And I would have a little chart, but it would only have like 3 things on it, right? Like when morale is +10, +20, +30, and you can't go above 40, right? When morale is -10, -20, -30, you can't go below 40. That's an extreme because morale is probably going to hover around 12 most of the time, right? So that's nuts. But something like that, like you pick your milestones, whether it's in increments of 3 or 5 or 8 or whatever, to find out where your outcomes are, right? You're looking at population sizes for different cities and stuff. You've got those listed out. I don't think that's necessary because I think that depending on the continent that you're on, the population size is going to fluctuate drastically, and what's considered a large army versus a large city will be different, right? The population should almost just be how many troops there are available.
Yeah, so part of this was stronghold management and building the basis for that, which pour one for the homies and wizards for making so I don't have to do that anymore. So I think a lot of this is gonna evaporate into the ether as I incorporate those Bastion rules in and kind of run through that and a lot of the other stuff can be kind of role play side. The big thing I think for me is making the defenses, because that's what's going to play within the scope of the mass combat, and that's what's going to modify those rules. Right? You have now you've got walls, you've got secured siege equipment that's pointed at a battlefield, you have a pre-controlled environment. What is that going to mean for the defender, and what is that going to mean for the attacker? That's the area to focus.
You have listed out here population, slots, domestic, and military for each, right? I would honestly, like, population is sure, fine, whatever, but I don't think it's ever going to matter, is it?
No.
So I would just have it be, how big is the city? Small, medium, large. Or maybe you say, fort, walled city, city with a keep, castle, palace, right? Like, however you want to do it, like, just by that level. It doesn't really matter what the population is, it's implied. And your players are not going to give a shit if there's 33,742 people in the city, right? So
too true.
So we care as DMs, but I don't think it should impact necessarily your overall idea of what's happening as far as your mechanics here in combat. The only time that I think it would be necessary to keep track of is how many people have died, how many citizens have died, either starvation or disease or just arrows coming over the wall, right? And again, it doesn't matter what the overall population is. We should just be tracking percentage. And those percentages should be thresholds where consequences come. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The other thing that I think you have listed out here, which I don't think matters at all to the mechanics of your combat, is how much gold per month.
Yep.
I don't think that matters. Like, you're talking combat, not economy. If you want to put in a portion like the people are going to riot because we've been under siege for so long and there's no money coming in and the king's coffers are empty, what are we going to do? Then sure, that's a cool plot point, but it shouldn't be tied to your mass combat mechanics.
Yeah.
Right? That's just a story beat.
Yeah, that's too in the weeds. You are right on that.
Also, you're adding troops per month. I think you should just have max troops. If you're under siege, everyone that can be conscripted gets conscripted. Bang, here you go, right? The soldiers go up first. Everybody's soldiers, veterans, and elites, they all go to war. If you need to, I wouldn't have a troops per month. I would have conscripts in reserve and have that be a number so that if the city falls beneath a certain threshold of soldiers, the conscripts can step up, right? But it's because there's always that classic scene, and we saw it at Helm's Deep, right? There's always that scene of arm the villagers because we don't have enough soldiers. Well, most cities will have soldiers. They will have soldiers already, right? There will be knights and town guard and palace guards and everything else. We've got an army because we're a city. That's what we do, right? It isn't until every man for themselves has to pick up a pitchfork and go to war that we start to get into the, oh shit, okay, what are our reserves? How many able bodies are there? So I would have max generals, which you have listed out here, max trained troops, and then max conscripts, right?
Like that.
And then when you're dealing with the percentage of the trained troops have been reduced to this amount, we replace them with the next amount of conscripts, but they are less effective, right? That's part of the siege.
Perfect. All good. This is the part I was excited to get to because I hadn't spent enough time on it yet.
This, I have thought about this kind of shit so often, and I would love to play these mechanics. But my table, the only person that would latch onto that would be Dave. Casey would be okay with it, and Dan would be like, "Oh, interesting." But I want to play D&D, right? And yeah. I would, Megan, Miek, and Charlie would not give a fuck, right? So I don't get to play with these, but I've thought about this a few times. I think
that's the benefit of having that second DM at the table, because I've got players who live for this kind of stuff, and players who could live their whole lives without any of it. So when we get to doing it, it's like, okay, well, sure, I could play the mass combat stuff, or I could drag Brian into the other room and we could play D&D while you guys do this for the next hour. We'll let you know how that goes.
Yeah, that's fair. I wish I had someone do that whenever shopping comes up. because I've got half of my players love shopping, the other half couldn't give a fuck. So
Yeah.
if
I feel like
I put
that's the real divisive issue in Dungeons and Dragons, right? Shopping.
Oh, I'm not kidding. Like Dan and Dave are ready to pull their hair out, but everybody else loves the idea of shopping. So
yeah, yeah. Everybody wants gold. Nobody wants to play through how they spend it, or spend it at all.
Yeah, right. And they all want to barter. My God. Before we go any further, I think that what you ought to do is come up with, because you've got cities, small, medium, large, and capital, and then you also have forts, which was tower, keep, or fortress, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a medieval world, the keep is like a small fortified building that's not small, it's fairly large, but like compared to the rest of the city, but it's within a city. A fort is just a walled structure out in the wilderness, right?
Right.
So I feel like what you should really look at is consolidating all of this to be like a fort, like a walled city, because a town is not going to have defenses. They're not going to have walls, right? The army is just going to roll through a town, but a city could have walls. I would include things like a city with a keep, a city with a castle, and a capital as well, right? And a capital always has a castle, right? So, and then call that a day. I don't think you need tower. An army will overrun a tower.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair enough point.
Or that wizard is going to be powerful enough to keep that army at bay, like Saruman, right?
Or just move his tower.
Or that. Fuck you guys, I'm going into the clouds. So I would choose what your actual sizes are and just consolidate that into one list. Have maybe 5 or 6 options that will help guide you. And if you wanted to put a general population size for your own notes on this, yeah, fuck, that's fine. Whatever, doesn't hurt. But that population size should not impact the mechanics. I don't think you need funds. Okay, so slots. You've got slots listed out here. I'm assuming these are defensible mechanics to add.
Yes. Yeah. So this is where you start talking about enhancing the defenses in one way or the other. Do you have like especially thick walls? Do you have siege equipment installed? Do you have like what are the enhancements that you've made? The bigger the city, the more that it can economically support that kind of thing. So that's why bigger spaces have more kind of slots for advancement.
Okay, let me drag this out of the ether here. I sat down a while ago with a couple of other hosts. I'm trying to find it now here, where we talked about what is available inside a building. Trying to remember which episode it was. I'm trying to look it up now because it just occurred to me that we've talked about this on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm still catching up.
No, fair enough. Episode 251. We got into rest stops, settlements, merchants, services, civil. Okay, fortifications. Here we go. We come up with a list of fortifications.
By me, I'm just flagging that episode.
So the things that impacted us, we did not include traps. These were just fortifications.
Mm-hmm.
So first and foremost, walls. I'm going to actually send you this list in a second here so that you can see it, because you're probably going to want to steal from this.
I'm sure that I do.
It is not a completely comprehensive list, but it is a decent list. So there we go. I just sent that through Discord, and now I'm going to kill it again so it doesn't beep at us. I've got walls, gates, moats and bridges, towers and turrets, armorers, weaponsmiths, scabbard makers. These are just things that exist in town. Like scabbard makers are not going to impact you, but having dedicated fletchers might. I'm not sure that a gallows is going to impact you at all, but a dungeon or a jail, somewhere to hold prisoners of war, might. A barracks, an armory, guard houses, and of course, ports. All of this becomes doubly as complicated the moment that you put it by water, right?
Yeah.
Now, the one thing that's not listed in any of this is, because we're dealing with medieval fantasy, what happens with air attacks? So you're going to need siege weapons or magical defenses as well on top of that, right?
Yeah.
So here are...
But you can get that like just that localized anti-magic or anti-glamour spaces.
Yeah. So when we've got different slots here, for let's grab something like a fort, right? We know immediately that a fort will have, without question, walls and a gate that can be closed. Whether or not it's on gigantic hinges or it's a portcullis or what it is, doesn't matter. You have a gate that can be closed, that is secure, right?
Mm-hmm.
With your walls, you don't necessarily have an area on top of the walls for your soldiers to patrol. Sometimes it's just walls. It's just gigantic logs that are, 14 feet tall that have been carved into spikes at the top, and that's it. When we look at slots for a fort, how many slots should we ideally have? Probably only 3 or 4. But by the time you get up to a capital city, my God, you could have 150 slots, right?
Yeah, I think the question is going to be like, what list of things do you have that directly modify the mechanics
Exactly.
of Fight Below?
I think that what you ought to do is come up with 3 stats that every single one of them should have that don't count towards slots. You need to figure out your walls and what the damage reduction is. You need to figure out your gates and what their damage reduction is. And you need to figure out the magical defenses. And I do mean like force fields and shields and anti-scry zones and that shit. I don't mean, well, we shoot fireballs. That's offensives, right? Like defense only. And then you should have a couple options in there. What do they have in these areas? Like the castle inside a large city should be scry-proof, right? Or at least the war room should be. So some of this stuff you're just going to have in your narrative, and it's not going to have a mechanical function. But having both the walls and the gates, and maybe even a magical barrier that is impervious to everything except, I don't know, acid, cold, and force for this city, right? Or it's impervious to everything except fire because we're in the Arctic. It's an Arctic fort or whatever, right? Like at that point, you can make the choices, but you should have a couple of vulnerabilities or rather a bunch of immunities, and some stuff will work against it, just to make your players think differently and have to discover, what does this magical barrier give us, right? What does it do, and how do we have to interact? And it doesn't have to be complete like immunity either. It can be like, you can run through it, but everyone gets the poisoned effect, or you take 4 levels of exhaustion. Well, that's too fucking scary. We got to bring that barrier down.
That's brutal.
Right? But I mean, it doesn't have to actually stop anything. It's just like you watch your hippogriffs that with the mounted combatants fly through the barrier, no problem, and then tumble out of the fucking sky. Well, what does that mean? We just lost a whole squad, right? So, but what this does is it opens it up so that we can then focus on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I would say max, even for a capital, max 5 different slots for unique defenses, because we've already covered walls. We've already covered maybe towers or turrets should be included in that as well. Because no self-respecting fort in any D&D scenario should ever not have a tower or a turret or a ballista to focus on, a fucking dragon. So in the world of D&D, people must watch the skies all of the time. So what are we dealing with here? Like, this is where we get to talk about, hey, we do have a moat, right? And the moat has a drawbridge. So it's a moat with a drawbridge. That's slot number 1. What does this do mechanically for us? It means that melee attackers cannot engage with our walls, right? We don't need to get any deeper than that. It just means that we're relying on siege weapons, maybe even those massive monsters that can wade through the moat and attack, or flyers or archers, right? We've just removed cavalry. Ineffective, doesn't work, right?
Yeah, nothing stops a horse quite like a wall.
Right? So this is where we get to think, but also think magically speaking. What if we could throw glamour up so the city is invisible unless you're within a certain radius? That means that you're ranged. It will technically work, but it's all with disadvantage, right? To hit anything of note, because you can't see it, but they can see out, they can shoot you. So now it's only melee that's going to be effective, right? Now we require battering rams and not catapults. So these are the kind of slots that we should be thinking of. And I would have things like 1 slot would be a gate, but it has a guardhouse, and it's got an overhang where they can, the guardhouse, there will be slots in the gate so that they can stab long pikes out the front of it. There we go. That's slot 1. Slot 2 is boiling oil, and slot that can be dumped down once every 5 minutes. It takes to replenish it to a maximum of 20 times because they will run out, right? That's a mechanical thing that I can fuck with. But I can also cast Fireball. There will be a giant dragon head above the portcullis, and it will actually shoot Fireball once per minute or recharge on a 6 or something, right? These are the kind of defenses we should be looking at for our slots. The stuff like walls, you just figure out, is it made of wood? Is it made of stone? Are the walls made of iron? Are they made out of a specific dwarven stonecraft that means that they've got a better DR, right? Like whatever, and then you just massage it from there. Keeping in mind that you're dealing with D6s plus modifiers. So all of your numbers should be relatively low, and keep that level of bounded accuracy in mind.
I mean, well, also,
yes,
I think without siege, you're not breaking through a wall. You can.
Yeah, this is where I wanted to include, those massive creatures, the flyers, the spell casters, right? I mean, yeah, disintegrate's gonna fucking work.
Yeah, right. And that's one of the things where you talk about giving them essentially siege monster or whatever version of that exists inside of the war mechanism here, so that if you're doing damage to like an object, it is significantly higher than what you would do to a combatant.
Yeah. The other thing that I want to point out is if you have not introduced black powder and gunpowder and cannons and guns yet into your world, then fucking don't, because that is going to, historically, that is when the moment cannons became a thing, walled cities stopped being a thing, right?
Yeah, they don't have guns now, other than the artificer's eldritch cannon, but
sure. Yeah, that's magical. It doesn't count.
No one's going to stop Cthulhu from doing what he's going to do, so it's
fine. All right. Yeah, they don't have barrels of gunpowder or TNT sticks or anything, right?
Right.
That was Terry's mistake when he ran Curse of Strahd, and we laid siege to Castle Ravenloft. Is we had gunpowder. We had a couple of barrels of it. That was Dan's mistake in Deep Dark Radiance. He gave me TNT. That was a gross misstep on his part. So
I mean, it's basically the only thing you can do against the horrors of the great beyond. So
that's very true. It's also the thing that I was doing against the monsters on the street, though. So the scope that you have right now is like 7 slots for a capital city. That feels really big, right?
Yeah.
You're focusing on, I'm summarizing here. You're focusing on gold and population sizes, which we don't need. Troops per month, you should just have a reserve of conscripts, right? Behind the soldiers, right? If the invading force is big enough, oh shit, yeah, we're going to need some of those conscripts right up front just for even numbers, right? But the last mechanic that I would start thinking about here, and I don't know if this fucks the whole mathematical system, is a mechanic to give a bonus to height. And I like this for both flyers and for people standing on top of walls defending cities. They'd get a +2 to their attack to hit, but does that swing it too much? Because I wouldn't give them advantage, which this is not accurate, but it's a close facsimile enough. It's almost about 4%, or +4 rather, on a D20 is when you add advantage. Almost. It's not exact and it fluctuates, but
it's close. It's close enough.
Yeah,
right?
General guideline is advantage counts as a +4 if you're worried about that kind of math. And disadvantage is a -4. I really think there should be a +2 to height advantage in mass combat, but then your player is going to be like, how come I don't get that in regular D&D? Well, because fuck you, that's why I'm the DM.
Because there are some advantages that only exist at scale.
Sure, yeah, and that makes perfect sense to me, but I think that you should sit down and really mull over the idea of height advantage.
I don't think that breaks it, because especially when you think we're combining stats together, right?
Yeah.
So that also washes some of that bonus.
Yeah.
So a +2 isn't as big when you're averaging at a 7 for a player character as opposed to an average add of a 4.
Yeah.
That's a big difference. So I think that +2 is enough to matter, but not enough to feel broken.
I agree, but I would also hazard to say that I would call it like extreme height differences. So the top of the hill versus the bottom of the hill doesn't get that advantage. I mean, they would in real life, but we're talking specifically flyers and walled defenders, right?
Right. And yeah. I don't, there are enough ways to manipulate the battlefield around other elements that I don't feel a need to be like, you are 1 meter above your opponent, so it's easier for you to whack their heads.
I just had that pop up at a table with a couple of new players where they were talking about how we were on a very small, like 15-foot ledge above a camp of goblins, and we were attacking. And one of them said, "I have advantage, right? Because I'm above them." And I stopped and I'm like, "In what fucking world, bud?" And his response was, "Baldur's Gate 3." I went, "Oh, still fucking no." Like,
yeah, no, but some of that stuff works really well in a video game.
Yeah.
Right? Because you don't have to keep track of it in your brain. There's a little robot in the background that's keeping track of all of those little changes. So they can say, yeah, absolutely, it makes sense. And sure, but that's one more thing for the DM to pay attention to. That's a colossal pain in the ass. So,
if you want to get that noodly, go play Pathfinder or 3.5. That kind of stuff is in there, right?
It sure is. It sure is. Now, what I will say is if somebody is really clever in a moment and tries to pull off a maneuver, I usually give them some kind of boon one way or the other.
Oh, yeah.
I like when people are in combat and like play it up a little bit rather than just, I hit this one, my third attack, I hit this one. Like, you give me a little flavor, I will reward you for that.
Yeah, and that's just it. Like, if we were jumping off of the ledge to put our body weight behind the swords to stab, then yeah, I might give you advantage on that single attack. But you're not getting advantage on every javelin you throw, right?
No.
So, if we're keeping
make it part of a maneuver,
yeah, right, and then I'm fine with that. That makes sense. If we're keeping the feats for the next episode, I think this is a good place to wrap up, unless there's something else you wanted to focus on.
No, I think that's good. I think by now people have to be tired of hearing from me, so give them a break.
Do you want to think about some of these city options, or maybe how spells might impact your combat, or something like that, so we can talk about more than just 12 feats on the next episode?
Yeah, I think the enhancements that we make to the city side and maybe even the troop types might be a viable add there.
Okay, that sounds great. Do you have any final thoughts, or people, or personal social media, or projects, or anything else you'd like to mention?
No. Get off the internet. It's a terrible place unless you're listening to us, I guess.
Yes.
Everything else sucks, though, so don't do that.
Yeah, in 2025, the internet looks like an absolute dystopian wasteland.
Yeah, I'm slowly erasing everything except for Discord, I guess.
Fair enough.
The only place that doesn't make me sadder when I log on to it.
All right, well, I guess that's all for our discussion on homebrewing mass combat rules. Thank you, Gerald, for choosing this topic and workshopping your homebrew, and of course for supporting the Patreon. And thank you to the listeners for listening to another episode of the It's a Mimic podcast. If you'd like to support us, we have a donate button on our website, itsamimic.com, a store with some It's a Mimic merch, and a Patreon. This episode and others can also be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and most other podcast apps. Thanks again for listening to It's a Mimic, where you never know what you're gonna get.